I got very good at it, the smile that arrived right on time. The cheerful voice on the phone. The way I said I'm fine, don't worry about me with such easy confidence that my children, grown adults, smart people who loved me, believed it completely. They had their own lives. Their own problems. Their own children to raise and jobs to manage and mortgages to navigate. The last thing they needed was to worry about their mother. So I made sure they didn't. My name is Francis. I am 64 years old. My husband, George, died 26 months ago after a brief and brutal illness, a diagnosis in March, a funeral in July, 4 months that felt like they lasted a year and also like they disappeared in the time it takes to blink. That we had been married for 38 years, that I had known him since I was 24. He had been the organizing fact of my adult life, not in a suffocating way, not in a way that made me less myself, but in the way that a person becomes part of your structure. Part of the furniture of how the world works. When he died, the world stopped working the way it had, and I spent 2 years pretending otherwise. That I pretended because I love my children and I did not want to be a burden. I pretended because I was their mother and mothers were supposed to be fine. I pretended because, if I was honest, I wasn't sure what would happen if I stopped. This is the story of what happened when I finally did. George and I had 3 children. Our eldest was Karen, 40 years old, who lived in Denver with her husband and their 2 sons. Karen was capable and organized and carried the family's logistical functions with the same calm competence she brought to her career in healthcare management. She called me every Sunday without fail. Our middle child was David, 37, who lived 40 minutes from me in the same city, Charlotte, North Carolina. He was a high school science teacher, thoughtful and slightly absent-minded in the gentle way of people whose minds are always working on 3 things at once. He came by for dinner every couple of weeks. Our youngest was Sophie, 34, who lived in Boston and worked in publishing and called me irregularly but for long conversations when she did. Sophie was perceptive in a way that sometimes made me careful around her. She noticed things, the way certain people notice things, and she asked follow-up questions. They were all good people. They had all been devastated by their father's death. And they had all, in their separate ways, grieved and then tried to find equilibrium. That I had told them I was finding equilibrium too. This was not entirely a lie. I was functioning. I was eating, sleeping, leaving the house, maintaining friendships, going to church, volunteering on Thursdays at the library, but functioning is not the same as being well. And I had confused those 2 things, or allowed my children to confuse them. For 2 years, the internal reality was this: I was the loneliest I had ever been. I missed George with a constancy that had not diminished with time, only changed in texture. I had stopped reading because we used to read together. I had stopped cooking properly because cooking for one felt like proof of something I didn't want to prove. I had stopped sleeping well and pretended otherwise. That I was holding a version of myself together with both hands and calling it fine. The performance, because that's what it was, required maintenance. I had learned the particular vocabulary of grief that satisfied questioners without alarming them. It comes in waves, but I'm managing. Some days are harder than others, but I'm okay overall. He would have wanted me to keep living fully. That last one was both true and useful. George had been a practical man who would have had no patience for prolonged mourning. He had told me this directly, once, when we talked about death the way long-married couples sometimes do, practically, without drama. Don't become one of those people who stops living, he had said. That's not how you honor someone. I used that against myself. I used it to tell myself that struggling was somehow disloyal to him. That the best thing I could do for his memory was to perform okayness. This was, I recognized later, a fairly sophisticated form of self-harm dressed in the language of love. Karen's Sunday calls were the most consistent challenge. She was thorough. She asked real questions. I had developed a small system for those calls, have something prepared to talk about, something specific and recent, so the conversation had content that wasn't about my internal state. A book I had picked up. A neighbor's news. Something from Thursday at the library. It worked. She finished those calls feeling reassured. I finished them feeling more alone than before. David noticed things sometimes, in person. He would pause in the middle of a conversation and look at me in that slightly unfocused way he had when he was actually focusing. I would redirect before he could form the question. Sophie was the one I was most careful around. Her perceptiveness was the thing that worried me most. The second year was harder than the first. The first year had been painful but structured. There were things grief required, legal processes, thank you notes, estate matters, the practical work of dismantling certain shared arrangements. These gave me purpose. I was busy in a way that moved forward. In the second year, the business of dying was finished. What remained was just the living. The ordinary continuation of days that no longer had the shape they had had for 38 years. I developed a habit of talking to George. Out loud, in the kitchen, usually in the evening. I am not someone who believes the dead can hear. But I believe that the act of speaking to someone, even someone absent, has its own value. It keeps a relationship present in a way that silence doesn't. I told him things I hadn't told the children. I told him I was tired. I told him the house was too quiet. I told him that Sunday evenings were the hardest part because Sunday evenings had been ours, cooking together, the week reviewed, the coming week discussed. I told him I was pretending. One evening I sat at the kitchen table after one of these conversations and realized something. I was more honest in a room talking to a dead man than I was with the living people who loved me. That observation arrived clearly, the way important things sometimes do, not gradually, but all at once, fully formed. I sat with it for a long time. I did not immediately do anything about it. But the seed of something had been planted that evening, without my fully realizing it. Sophie came to visit in October. She had booked a long weekend, Thursday to Sunday. She said she had work in a nearby city and would make a detour. I believed this. I later found out the work had been cancelled, but she had come anyway. She arrived Thursday evening. I had made dinner. The house was clean. I was wearing something that wasn't just around the house clothes. I had prepared. We had a good evening. We talked. We laughed. I told her things I had prepared to tell her. Friday morning she came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and I didn't hear her until she was right behind me. I had been standing at the counter with the coffee in my hand, not moving, staring at the garden where George used to sit on Saturday mornings. I don't know how long I had been standing there. I don't know what my face was doing. She said, "Mom." I turned around and smiled. "Morning," I said. She looked at me. Not quickly, not politely. She looked at me the way she looked at things she was trying to understand. "How long were you standing there?" she said. "Oh, just a moment," I said. "Coffee?" She sat down at the kitchen table. She didn't take her eyes off me. "Mom," she said again. Different this time. Quieter. More specific. "I'm fine," I said. It came out automatically. Fluently. 2 years of practice. She said, "I don't think you are." I had several responses available. I had been maintaining this performance for 2 years and I had deflected more probing questions than Sophie's. I could redirect. I could find something true to say that wasn't the whole truth. I could move the conversation sideways. I stood at the kitchen counter with the coffee pot in my hand and I felt all of those responses available to me. And then I felt something else. Exhaustion. Not physical, I had been physically tired for 2 years. This was different. It was the exhaustion of maintenance. The particular tiredness of someone who has been holding a position too long and feels, finally, the full weight of what it has cost. Sophie was sitting at the same table where I had talked to George at night. The same table where, a few months ago, I had recognized that I was more honest with a dead man than with the living people who loved me. I put the coffee pot down. I sat down across from her. And I did not deflect. "No," I said. "I don't think I am either." Sophie was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me." I told her. Not all of it at once. 24 months of carefully managed concealment doesn't exit in one conversation. But I started. I told her about the Sunday evenings. About talking to her father in the kitchen. About the reading I had stopped doing. About the sleep. About the cooking for one. I told her I had been pretending. She listened to all of it without interrupting. She sat very still and she let it come in its own order, and she didn't try to fix anything or say the reassuring things people say. When I finally stopped, she looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I've been worried for a year. I just didn't know how to get past the wall." We talked for 3 hours that Friday morning. The coffee got cold. Neither of us noticed. Sophie told me things in return, that she had called Karen after several visits and said she thought something was wrong. That Karen had said she felt it too but didn't know how to raise it. That they had talked about it and agreed to wait for me to open the door. "You were all waiting," I said. "We didn't want to push," Sophie said. "You kept saying you were fine and we wanted to respect that." I thought about that. 3 people who loved me, watching and waiting, taking my word for something they suspected wasn't true. Not because they were fooled, they hadn't been fooled. Because they were being respectful of my stated experience. I had been so focused on managing their worry that I had not considered what it felt like for them to watch me from a distance and be uncertain. That realization was uncomfortable in a new way. "I thought I was protecting you," I said. "I know," Sophie said. "But we're your children, not your patients. We're supposed to be allowed to worry about you." I had no answer for that. It was too accurate. She called Karen that afternoon, with my permission. She called David. Not to alarm them, to tell them that Mom had talked, that things were real, that they should call. Karen called that evening. David came over Saturday morning. The wall I had maintained for 2 years came down over a single weekend. Not neatly, not all at once, but the structure of it was gone. What remained after it fell was not disaster. It was just people who loved each other, finally being honest. The weekend was not comfortable. Real conversations after long silence rarely are. Karen was careful on the phone, she processed externally, out loud, and I could hear her working through both her concern for me and something else, a kind of grief that I think came from realizing that the years since her father's death had contained a version of her mother that wasn't fully true. David sat at my kitchen table Saturday morning and didn't say very much. He made tea and held his mug and looked at the garden. Then he said, "I should have come more." "You came," I said. "Not enough," he said. "I told myself you had your routine. I told myself you were fine." "I told you I was fine," I said. "Yes," he said. I let that be enough because it was easier. That honesty from him, his willingness to take his own portion of it, meant more than I expected. I had spent 2 years managing their feelings by withholding information. And they had, in their own ways, accepted the management because it was easier than pressing through. We had all, collectively, failed each other in the gentle, ordinary way that families fail each other, not through cruelty, not through indifference, but through the accumulated decisions to take the easier path in small moments. Sunday morning, the 4 of us were on a call together, Sophie from the living room, Karen from Denver, David beside me at the table. Karen said, "What do you actually need, Mom? Not what you think we want to hear. What do you actually need?" I thought about it honestly. For the first time in 2 years. "I need to not be alone so much," I said. Things changed after that weekend. Not all at once. Not dramatically. In the practical, sustainable ways that actual change happens, small adjustments, held consistently, adding up over months into something that was genuinely different. David started coming by every week instead of every couple of weeks. Not for long visits, sometimes just an hour on a Wednesday evening. But regular. Reliable. The frequency itself was a form of presence. Karen's Sunday calls became different. Not longer, but more honest. She stopped asking "Are you okay?" and started asking "How has this week actually been?" The question required a different kind of answer. Sophie called more irregularly but more deeply. She had always been the one most willing to go into difficult places, and the conversations became fuller. I made an appointment with a grief counselor. I had refused one 18 months earlier because I had told myself, and them, that I was managing well. I had been wrong about that, and I was willing to say so now. The counselor's name was Patricia. She was calm and experienced, and she said, in our first session, something that landed precisely: grief that isn't witnessed can become a place you live instead of a place you pass through. I had been living in it. I began, with Patricia's help, to move through it instead. I also started cooking properly again. Not every night. But some nights. I made George's favorite soup one Sunday and ate it at the table, and it was painful and also right. Something about cooking it was an acknowledgement, of him, of the loss, of the fact that the loss was real and I had been only partially allowing myself to feel it. The reading came back slowly. The sleeping improved. It is 14 months since that October weekend. I am not the same as I was before George died. I will never be that person again, and I have made my peace with that. Grief doesn't aim to return you to who you were. It aims to incorporate the loss into who you become. I am different in ways I didn't expect. I am more direct about what I need. This did not come naturally to a woman of my generation who had spent decades in the role of the capable, untroubling mother. It required practice. It still requires practice. But I am better at it than I was. I am less willing to pretend. When Karen asks how the week has been, and it has been hard, I say it has been hard. She does not fall apart. My children, it turned out, were more capable of handling their mother's honest grief than I had believed. I had underestimated them by trying to manage them. David and I have started doing something I would not have expected. On Sunday mornings, sometimes, we take a walk. Just the two of us. We talk or we don't, depending on the day. He brings coffee in paper cups and we walk through the neighborhood where I have lived for 22 years. George used to walk this neighborhood on Saturday mornings. I tell David things about his father that he didn't know. Stories from before the children arrived, from the early years of our marriage, from the versions of George that existed before he was dad. David listens. He asks questions. He says, sometimes, I didn't know that about him. I think this is one of the things George would have wanted. Not the grief managed away, but the memory of him passed along honestly. Not the pretending, but the real thing. Sophie was right that weekend in the kitchen. I was not fine. And she was right to press past the wall I had built. But here is what I understand now that I didn't then: the wall was not built to protect my children. It was built to protect me. From the reality of the loss. From having to be seen in it. From the vulnerability of asking for help from the people I had spent 40 years being strong for. The irony is that the moment I let the wall down, the strength came back, not the performed kind, but the real kind. The kind that comes from being known and loved and not having to hold anything alone anymore. My mother used to say, a burden shared is a burden halved. I spent 2 years proving her wrong by refusing to share it. I am spending the rest of my years proving her right.